Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to representation within the returned or les revenants. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying Eduqas A-level media studies, as the returned currently appears on the specification for component 2. We're going to start by having a think about gender within the set episode. If you have a look at the representation of women within the episode, several of the women are represented in quite conventional and fairly stereotypical ways. Women like Claire, for example, are seen as that kind of typical archetypal mother, caring, domestic, looking after her children, quite emotional as well. You have people like Julie, who is a nurse, caring for Mr. Costa, looking after Victor. So there are several female characters who behave in quite reasonably typical ways that we often see women represented as in the media. There are several scenes where women are shown as being completely caught up in grief and extreme emotion and fear, lots and lots of crying, lots of tears. People like Adele, for example, are very close to some kind of nervous breakdown, so very clearly showing women as being super emotional and very vulnerable. And contrasts with the way the men are represented within the scene. The men are seen as perhaps less emotional, more rational, coming up with physical ideas and plans for how to deal with their grief. When Claire calls her ex-husband and he comes to the door, it's very clear that he does not believe her. It's representing this idea that men often don't believe in women and don't trust them. Of course, women are often sexualised in the media as well, and that also happens within this set episode. We see Lena, who decides to stay at home and truant from school, from the school trip, in order to have sex with her boyfriend. She's a teenager. I think she's supposed to be 15 in this set episode. So, there's a kind of sex scene within the episode. Obviously, you don't see very much, but there's definitely implied sexual activity there. And the fact is that, later on within other episodes, as she's grown up, she's fairly sexualised as well. The character of Lucy is seen having sex with one of the parents for money, implying that she's some kind of sex worker. Again, is quite a conventional way of portraying the genders. And this represents men as using women for sex, quite a traditional way of thinking about gender in the media. Men in the episode are often seen as being leaders in positions of power. You have men leading the kind of bereavement group at the beginning, men coming up with ideas about how to mourn their dead children and coming up with memorials. You have men leading churches, you have men as doctors and psychiatrists. So there's quite a lot of males in position of power and dominance. Most of the men are seen as being fairly unemotional, and that's quite a typical way of representing men. We think about this toxic masculinity idea that men should not cry, men should not be upset. And a lot of the men in this episode are fairly rational and emotionally detached. Think about Victor, who shows virtually no emotion in this at all. Even Mr. Costa, who's obviously quite shocked that his wife has returned from the dead, he doesn't really cry or break down. He simply burns her to death. So there's a fairly rational and often quite aggressive reaction from men. You have the male character banging on the door, looking for his girlfriend. There's a lot of aggression from men. There's some violence. So, for example, the killer Serge in the kind of underpass. There's violence against women from men. But in terms of actual emotions and showing and expressing your emotions in an appropriate way, that is absent, and that represents men in a fairly typical fashion. If you have a look at the representation of age as well, we often think of adults being seen in the media and in real life as being responsible and mature. And I suppose there is some of that within this episode. It's the parents that the children go to for help and support. It's the parents who are organising memorials. It's the parents and the adults that come to, check out Camille when she comes back from the dead to make sure she's okay. So there is a fairly typical representation of adults being reasonably mature and responsible. However, there's also violence from a lot of the adult characters. There's people killing other people, Mr. Costa, Serge. So there's murders going on, which I guess represents adults as being quite volatile as well. We often see adults as represented as being quite clever, knowing what's going on, people who can help, people who can solve problems. And actually, although people go to the adults, to get help, there is this idea of Camille asking her parents for help. None of the adults actually have any answers. They don't actually know what's going on. So perhaps we're seeing adults within the set episode shown as being fairly responsible, wanting to be responsible, but not actually being able to help. So perhaps showing adults as being fairly helpless. And that's, again, that kind of ties in with this horror supernatural genre, because if we see adults as helpless, it makes it even scarier because we don't know what's going to happen and there are no characters that we think are going to be able to help. Teenagers in the media are often represented in a variety of quite negative ways, and we do see this replicated within the episode. There's quite fairly angsty teens. There's people focusing on sex. You've got Lena having sex with her boyfriend. You've got drinking and doing shots in a bar when she's slightly older and potentially breaking a lot of the rules. There's a lot of smoking, rebellious behaviour, rule breaking. And so I suppose the representation of teenagers is fairly typical as well. Children are often stereotyped as being quite innocent, needing to be protected. And I suppose we do see other characters treating Victor as though he is innocent and vulnerable and needs to be protected. However, as an audience, we are shown a slightly more odd representation of Victor. We know that he was there at the crash, and we know that he is different or strange or odd because of the way that he's shown and the silence and the way he doesn't talk, the ominous music and the strange camera angles of him. So he is perhaps represented in a slightly more ominous way than children are typically represented in the media. And that perhaps ties in with this whole idea of the kind of horror supernatural style genre of this, trying to make it feel more scary and to make somebody who typically we would see as being an innocent victim seem quite ominous and not to be trusted. That creates a lot of enigma for an audience, makes them want to watch and find out why Victor is so strange in comparison to other children. In terms of ethnicity, the show lacks diversity in a big way. Basically, all of the characters in the set episode are white, or they certainly appear white. And if you watch the rest of the series, it's fairly like that as well. Perhaps this reflects the quite rural French setting, the kind of place that it is set within France, I suppose, lacks diversity anyway. Country areas within France are often fairly white in terms of demographics. It could also reflect a general, feeling of discrimination within the media industry, that people from ethnic minority backgrounds aren't often cast or represented within media products and dramas. And so, some audiences are definitely going to feel that the representations here aren't as diverse as they could be and could actually include, different people from different backgrounds. Have a look at the way the formerly dead characters are represented as they come back to life, the actual returned characters. They're definitely represented as being strange, or what we call other. If you look at Stuart Hall's theory, they are seen as savages, non-human. They are later on in the series, they are driven out of town and kept in camps separate from the rest of the people. They're not allowed to interact with others, and they're very much segregated from the rest of society. We have characters associated with violence and murder. So, people like Serge, some of these characters are actually dangerous, and certainly we see the alive characters fearing the dead characters. So there's a big binary opposition between the representation of the dead and the living. Although it should be noted that in the first episode, which is the set episode for Study, that binary opposition is less noticeable. They're not rotting, for example, in the first episode, although the dead do start to rot later on, which makes them feel more scary. They're not eating flesh in the first episode, although that does happen later on within the series. And in the first episode, there are certain characters, particularly people like Camille, for example, who are represented as not being that different from the living characters. And I suppose that helps the audience to start questioning whether they are any different and whether people should be scared of them or not, or whether they are just normal, or as normal as they can be. So the representations, are fairly interesting and they vary throughout the series. Another reason for the representations within this show could be to do with the possible allegory created by the writers. Now, the writers have never confirmed this, but there were definitely rumours that when the writers created the show, they wanted to use the show as an allegory or a kind of moral story, if you like, to illustrate the way that immigrants were being treated in France at the time. Lots of immigrants were arriving in France to try and cross the border into the UK and into other countries. And so they were being kept in refugee camps, places like Calais, for example. They were being separated and segregated with lots of police around. There were lots of rumours of violence and aggression, and the media stirred up a lot of fear and panic about these refugees, these immigrants. And so supposedly the writers created this show and wrote the characters to try and illustrate the way that the refugees were being treated in France at the time. And they showed that by kind of showing the way that the dead characters are eventually ostracised and kept separate, and how they are feared by the kind of living characters. And so perhaps that is why the dead are represented the way that they are. So that was my easy to understand guide to representation within the Returned. Don't forget to check out my channel for other videos that are going to be relevant for you. And if you have a video you would like that I don't already have, leave a little comment below and I'll see what I can do.